Hi everyone, here at the Australian Armour and Artillery Museum during AusArmourFest 2024 and taking a look at one of their vehicles that's on static display. And this is an example of the Infantry Tank MkIII, or it was commonly known in British service, the Valentine. Now, British tank doctrine developed in the 1930s recognised that there were three types of tanks for different types of missions. Light tanks were to be used for scout and reconnaissance, cruiser tanks were to be used for armoured breakthroughs and engaging other tanks, and infantry tanks were to be designed for supporting infantry that was on the move and breaking up hard points and neutralising enemy infantry. And the Valentine tank here, the Infantry Tank MkIII, was an example of the latter. Now, it was developed as a privately designed vehicle by Vickers-Armstrong, and that development started before World War II. And it was proposed that it be based on a cruiser tank, or a tank fighting tank that Vickers had previously developed, called the A-10. So taking the suspension of the A-10 at the basis, they added some more armour, which is in line with being an infantry tank. If it's going to support infantry and be exposed, you need some more armour to help it shrug off hits from artillery as it's moving along and supporting the infantry. And so armour became more important than mobility, so it generally had a lower speed than a cruiser tank. Now, it was mounted in the design proposal with a QF 2-pounder or 40mm gun, and it was also generally to be fitted with a coaxially mounted 7.92 BESA machine gun. Design was submitted to the War Office February 1938, however they weren't impressed because it only had a two-man turret, and British doctrine typically had a three-man turret, a loader, a gunner and a commander, so the design wasn't approved. However, a year later, spring 1939, the War Office did approve the design because it started to see what was happening in Europe and that there would be a need for more tanks. So the design was approved July 1939, and the idea was that deliveries would start in May 1940. At that point, the vehicle went for trials, and it coincided with the exact time when the British were starting to lose a lot of their heavy equipment in the Battle of France. So given these losses on the continent, the tank was rushed into production as the Tank Infantry MkIII. They built 109 by the end of September 1940. They found that it was significantly cheaper to build than the Matilda II that it replaced, given that it was a lot lighter and used a lot less material. And it had a reliable and proven driveline that had all been previously used on the A-10 cruiser tank. It was used to equip cruiser tank units in the British Army, and it was also supplied to the Commonwealth Tank Brigades of the 8th Army in North Africa from June 1941, alongside the cruiser Mark VI or Crusader tank. It was produced in 11 major variants, with many specialised variants as well. Total production was around 8,275. About 6,800 of these were built in the UK by two companies, Metropolitan Camel Carriage and Wagon, which was an associate of Vickers-Armstrong, as well as Birmingham Railway Carriage and Wagon Company. The Canadians also produced about 1,400. These were produced at CPR Angus workshops in Montreal. And a number of these, after being sent to the UK, were also supplied to the Soviets under Lend-Lease, and the Soviets started using it from the point of about the Battle of Moscow. So it had a few different main guns along the way. Marks 1 through 7 used the QF 2-pounder 40mm gun, and Marks 3 and 5 had a redesigned version of this gun with a new mantlet that allowed the turret to accommodate a third crew member, to accommodate a loader. However, from Mark 8 they went up to the QF 6-pounder gun or 57mm anti-tank gun, and they lost that extra space for the loader, so they went back to a turret consisting of 2 personnel. The Mark 11 had the QF 75mm, which shared common ammunition with the Sherman 75, and the New Zealanders produced a special version of the Mark III called the Mark III CS that mounted a QF 3-inch howitzer that they employed during their activities in the Pacific, particularly in the Solomon Islands. So a special version was built by the New Zealanders there. There was also amphibious versions, the duplex drive versions that were used as training tanks and employed in Italy, as well as a bridge-laying variant that Australia had one example of, and which the British used throughout the Burma campaign. So a lot of different variants were built. So in terms of armour, it had 65mm up front. Side armour was initially 60mm, but that was cut back to 50mm from the Mark III to save on weight. So in terms of chassis, so you've got a rear-mounted drive sprocket with a rear-mounted engine, very similar to most British tanks at the time. The suspension itself is 4 bogies on the tank. Each bogie has 3 wheels, a larger one at the end, and then 2 smaller ones, and they're mounted on separate arms which articulate relative to each other. That articulation is controlled by a coaxial spring and damper. In terms of engine, this version, the Mark II, had an AEC A190 diesel engine, a 6-cylinder developing about 98 kilowatts. that could move the tank along at about 24 kph. Same top speed as the MkIII II infantry tank that it replaced, but given it was much lighter, about 7 to 8 tons lighter than the MkIII, that top speed was more easily attained, the acceleration was better, and it could maintain that speed. Later versions of the tank also used GMC diesels, 6004 diesels. The first version of the tank, the Mark I, had a petrol engine that wasn't considered very successful. Now, the tank was used in most theatres of World War II. The Soviets used it in the East, was used in the Western Desert against the Italians and the Germans, was used in the Pacific against the Japanese, both in the Pacific Islands and also in Burma, and was also used in Italy, and some specialised variants were also used in Normandy. Now, when it went into production in the middle of 1940, it was the best tank the British had available in production by far. It was relatively well armed, relatively well armoured, and was relatively reliable. And it went on to equip a number of divisions, both in the UK and also in the Western Desert. So when the British were facing the threat from Italy in Egypt from September 1940, this was the tank they had available to deploy in large numbers to help counter that threat. And it was going to be a long time before the Lend-Lease hardware from the US would start to come online. So it was an important early war tank for the British. So I want to thank you for getting to the end of the video and listening to me bang on about the Valentine MkII, or the Infantry Tank MkIII. Appreciate you getting to the end, and I look forward to talking to you soon about another tank or armoured vehicle. Until then, stay well.